What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Hey, how you doing? And if you're into the history of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, maybe you're just into the mythology and maybe you just read the syllabus to a class one time and you were like, this does not sound like it's for me. Well, this is the channel for you because I basically like to oversimplify very complex, ancient ideas and stories because I thoroughly enjoy them. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, then you guys are going to want to hit that subscribe button and that bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. But as you can see from the title of today's video, we're going to be starting a whole new series here on the channel, which I'm super excited about because we're going to be discussing my favorite, like literally my favorite poem of all time. I think it is genuinely not the most beautiful, but it's the most enjoyable ancient story that we have, and that is the Iliad. So today's episode will just be context that you guys should really know going into the Iliad. So this video is designed for those of you who have just bought the book and you think that you might need to know something before going into it, or if you're thinking about reading it, or maybe you're studying it at school and you're a little bit lost because you guys just started reading it and you're like, what is going on? So this is all the context that before you pick up the book, before you can really appreciate the story, this is stuff that you should really know. And it's stuff that I wish someone had told me before I first started reading the book, because I feel like it would have changed the way that I read it the first time. So yeah, that's what we're doing today. Now, this video will be split up into 3 different parts. So we're gonna be discussing Homer first and foremost, and sort of the author and the Greek world that he was writing in. We're then going to be discussing the context for the story itself and how the Iliad is worked. And then we'll be discussing resources that you guys can go to throughout your reading, aside from these videos. Obviously, this is going to be the first place that you come. But after all of that, so that you have these different resources and different easy ways of learning the story and learning what's happening and keeping track of everything that's going on. So let's start with Homer. Homer is the author of the Iliad. He's not only author of the Iliad, though, he is also author of the Odyssey, which is the sequel to the Iliad. Homer himself dates back to about the 8th century BC. Now, what does that mean? Because I know a lot of people are always like, I just need the exact date. So the exact date is probably around 750 BC. That's the one that classicists usually settle on. I think if you even go to like the dictionary, like the classical dictionary, they'll also say 750 BC. And that's because really, guys, anywhere between 800 and 700 BC, you're right with the dates. We don't have an exact date for Homer. We don't know when he was born, when he died. We don't know any of that stuff. But about 750 for when these works came out, yeah, you're right. Now, the reason why people harp on the Iliad as like the most important work from the ancient world is because it's the first substantial piece of writing that we have from the ancient world. And by that, I mean the book is 24 chapters long. So it's chapters, we say books in the ancient world. So every time I say book 5, I mean chapter 5. So it's 24 of those, and it comes from 750, and no one had written anything like that beforehand. Or if they did, it doesn't survive. So this is the first time we get a substantial piece of work, which is just chef kisses everywhere. Chef, oh yes. The Iliad is a poem, which means that it was written in verse. That's important, we'll get onto that in a second. And it actually details the Battle of Troy. So Achilles, Patroclus, Hector, all of those heroes come to us in this book. Now, the main question that people constantly ask me, I'm constantly getting these in my DMs, and I'm getting them when I talk to classic students, whether you're in secondary school or whatever it happens to be. Everybody always asks me, why, if it's about Troy, is the book not called Troy? It actually is. So Ilium in Greek, the word for Troy is Ilium, right? So they will constantly write in the book like Great Ilium, the walls of Ilium, the kingdom of Ilium. It's Troy. So the Iliad is just the story of Troy. So that's important when you read it because a lot of times translators won't change that. They'll just keep it as Ilium in the book. So you should probably know that. The fact that the Iliad is a poem, though, is like super important to understanding it because it would have been written to a beat because it's a poem. Now that might sound a little bit weird, but we need to think about poetry in the ancient world more so as like spoken word, right? So it's like that sweet spot in between actual like singing, performing in that sort of a way, and just telling a story. Okay, so the Iliad would have been performed. It would have been performed like spoken word, and we know that also because it was written to a beat called dactylic hexameter. I will not be going into exactly what that is, but very long explanation short. The beat was more so like a long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, can sometimes be long, 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 short, short, long, 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 short, short. It really depends on the syllables of the words that are used, but that is how it's written. So there's this undercurrent, more so like a drumming beat to the poem, which is very appropriate because it's a war poem. But also we need to remember that because the poem is hella long, like it's crazy long. Like I said, it's 24 chapters. And the idea that someone would have performed this already is like, excuse me? But the fact that it's to a beat, it's kind of in the way that, you know, like you can remember lyrics to your favorite song, right? Like, oh, that's really cool that you can remember like the entire album, the entire of somebody's discography, you can remember. It's in the same way, right? So it's because this was to a beat, it probably would have made memorization a lot easier for the people who were performing it. But who would have performed it? That's a very good question that I have no doubt you guys are asking. And the people who would have performed it were called bards. Now, what is a bard? So a bard is someone who was a performer, but they would have been hired more so for like dinner parties, right? So in the ancient world, dinner parties were like a big thing. They would have happened like all the time, and they would have literally gone on for hours. And so dinner and a show was part of that. And the show part was oftentimes a bard. So a bard would come in and they would sing, I don't know, book 5 of the Iliad. And the guys would ask for it and they would just be like, dope, no problem. And then they would start singing. So that is the role of a bard, that they would get up and they would sing these things. It was basically never written down. It was just that the bards would say it to these super rich elite people. And that's how they would then know the story. Not a lot of people would read the story. They would hear it. They would hear it being sung at dinner. Now this is important, okay? Knowing that bards would have sung it is important because storytelling in general in the ancient world, as I just said, it was oral, okay? So the majority of stories that we have written down are only written down because they were part of oral tradition. And they were only written down because someone at some point was like, maybe we should have a reference for this story so that everybody knows what we're actually saying, so that if someone's gonna recite like book 2 of the Odyssey, then they have a reference point. So that's why they got written down. But they were sung for generations. Like, they were passed down from bard to bard to bard. Like, this was a story that was known basically as ancient history to the people who were hearing Homer's rendition of this story. This means that it probably wasn't the only version of the story. It's just because this is the only version that survives of the story, that's the one that we happen to know. So no doubt there were like hundreds of other bards who maybe were like Homer, we'll get onto that in a second, but probably hundreds of other bards that might have had different details in the story. They might have varied scenes slightly, in the same way that when we read stories of, you know, like the Disney princesses and whatever, you have the original stories that were really quite dark. If you haven't read any of them, I highly suggest that you do because they're very different. But it's sort of in that way that maybe a lot of other bards had different versions of the story, but Homer's is just the one that was written down, and it's the only one that we have. So we know that this is at least one version of the story, but it probably isn't the only. So if Homer wrote it down, was he a bard? Good question, people. We have no clue. I'm gonna be real with you. Our knowledge of Homer is incredibly limited. So we know that he was the author of the book, and that's about it. Literally. So there is theory that he could have been a bard. It is most probable that he was a bard simply because he knows the entire story. And let me tell you, the Iliad is thick. She is a thick book. So it is highly likely that Homer was a bard, but actually the evidence for this that lots of classicists latch onto, which I think is a little bit silly, is that in the Odyssey there is a bard called Demodocus who's blind, and people are like, oh, look at that, that's Homer writing himself into the story. And I'm like, that's the evidence that we have that Homer was a bard. I think the fact that he wrote the story down is better evidence than the fact that Demodocus as a character exists. It's not the point of this video. But was he a bard? Possibly. Now, we don't even know if Homer was a singular person. Let's just put that on the table for you guys, okay? There is absolutely no certainty when it comes to Homer's character. None whatsoever. In fact, there's a theory that is thrown about the classical world that possibly Homer was an umbrella term for lots of bards or lots of storytellers, in the same way that Monty Python is an umbrella term, but Monty Python is a name. So in the way that you would write, Monty Python performed this, Monty Python is, you know, did this. I think on every single one of the movies, it's like Monty Python presents. Could that have been how Homer was? That it was actually just like a club of authors that all went under the name Homer? And all the ancients knew that, but we don't know that. Like, you know, it's things like that. Basically, we know all about Homer. And that is absolutely vital. But it also, this is why, just a side note, this is why The Simpsons is funny, because The Simpsons, the main dude, obviously is called Homer Simpson, and he is this dummy who literally says dough every 5 seconds, and that's why it's funny, because his name is Homer, who wrote the most important book from the ancient world. It's funny. Now you guys are in on a classics joke in pop culture. I love doing that. But now you guys are in on it. So hopefully when you watch The Simpsons with somebody who might not know that, you'll be like, did you know? Last thing contextually about Homer and the time that he was writing is that the story, like I said, is ancient history to him, which means that the story was set, the Battle of Troy is set in about 1200, 1100 BC, which is coming up to the end of the Mycenaean period. Now, of the Mycenaean period, this is like the golden age of heroes, okay? So we have, right at the beginning, you have like Hercules, for example, as part of this era, Theseus, who I hate, but he's still part of this. And you also have Jason, he's another really famous one. And then towards the end, we have, you know, Achilles, Hector, all those people. They're all part of the same generation of heroes. So that's Mycenaean times. And then Homer writes about that, about what? 200, 300, 400. Maths is not my forte, but about like 400 years later, he's like, hey, this thing that happened 400 years ago, it's ancient history to him. Just bear that in mind. Whether it's real or not, that's a whole other video, which I'm not getting into. But whether the battle really did happen, it would have been ancient history to our author. And more importantly, during that time, we sort of go from this very interesting part of mythology and legend, which is all based in humans fighting monsters and these weird sort of things that pop up everywhere, and you're like, ooh, what? Theseus has to kill the Minotaur, and Hercules has to do his 1,000,005 labors, and Jason has to defeat this whole snake thing. Like, what is going on? We sort of move from that era to men fighting men, which is the Trojan War, and then the gods, you know, coming down and fucking it up because they're bored and they have nothing else to do. But moving into the context for the story itself. So the story itself, it's about Troy, but it does not give you the entirety of the Trojan War, which I know to a lot of people who are not familiar with this text and are not familiar with the ancient world are probably thinking, what the f is the point of this then, if it doesn't even tell me the entire story? So Homer, our dude or our group of dudes, whoever, so Homer actually sets this story in like the last year of the war, so we're about 9.5 years into the battle, and believe me, they harp on this all the time. They've been like, we've been here for so long, it's been 9 years. So we know that they've been there for a really long time. But the ancients would have also known the previous 9 years to the battle, so even though we get dropped in the 9.5 years in, the ancients would have known what happened beforehand, which is the point of me telling you the context. But you're probably wondering, how did the ancients know this story? How would they have known that? All of this stuff leading up to it if this is the only text that we have. And that's because the Iliad was part of this epic cycle. So we have all of these epic poems that were part of the epic cycle, and we have them referenced from other writers. So later writers will say, oh, in this book, we know that Penthesilea died, for example. I am so salty that that book doesn't survive. But we have lots of references from later authors who reference this work, and so we can therefore sort of plot where things happened kind of in these books, but none of the books survive. In fact, the epic cycle was once 9 books long. 9 for one battle, and the aftermath of this battle. 9 goddamn poems, of which 3 survive. It hurts my soul. So classicists, that's kind of our job. Our job is to literally piece together this story from other references so that we can tell you, oh, these are all the things that would have happened and blah, 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 until this weird argument that we're dropped into in the Iliad. But you know what, let's just do the context beforehand, because you need to know why the Battle of Troy started, because that is a main conflict that happens within the Iliad, that they're constantly bickering about how this whole thing started and why they're even there. So you need to know. So let's just go into the mythology of that. The reason why the Trojan War started is because of 2 marriages, really. So we have a mortal marriage and a divine marriage, but we'll go into the mortal one first, then we'll go into the divine one because I find that's easier, and then they all link up, and then it causes a lot of shit, basically. So the mortal marriage begins when Helen was actually a maid, shall we say. The relationship was consummated, and out came Helen, because Zeus decided, in true Zeus fashion, he dressed up as a swan, well, he disguised himself as a swan, comes down to Earth, seduces this woman called Leda, and Leda then hooks up with the swan. Once again, this is mythology. Leda hooks up with the swan, and then she ends up laying an egg, like a literal egg, and out pops Helen from the egg. Now, because Helen is half divine and she's, you know, Zeus's child, she is literally the most beautiful woman in the entire world. And everybody says it, everybody's like, oh my goodness, Helen is just just gorgeous. So when she comes of age, she ends up, you know, her mother and the king get married. So the king ends up like basically telling all of the other kings in Greece, being like, my daughter, who's the most beautiful woman in the world, she is now of age to get married, which in ancient times was like 13, 14 years old, 15 at oldest. Like that would have been like a hag at that point. So we're talking like 13, 14 years old. The king puts out this huge message and he's like, hey guys, Helen's now available to be married. Come through, you all can compete, and then I'll see who's the best man for the job. And obviously all the kings hear about this and they're like, get my boat, we have to go and marry Helen. I'm ready, I'm so ready for this. They all go to where Helen is, they all compete. And as they're there, all the kings start to realize like this is kind of getting out of hand and we're all getting very territorial of Helen because we all want to marry her. So Odysseus, who's one of the kings, he says to everybody like, look, we all need to come up with an oath. We need to come up with an agreement that whoever wins fairly, mind you, whoever fairly wins Helen's hand and is given Helen by her dad, we all need to make a pact that we will not try and steal Helen. I just hit the table, I'm very sorry. But we'll not try and steal Helen from this guy. And if anybody tries to, then we're all going to get on our boats and we're going to attack him, because the whole point was to encourage people to not do it. So by threatening that we'll form an army ourselves and attack you to get Helen and to give her back to the rightful person, it just was supposed to, you know, scare the other person, basically, if that's what they were planning. But all the Greek heroes agree. They're all like, actually, that sounds like a great plan, because they all kind of also think that they're gonna win. So they're like, I don't want anybody to attack me. That doesn't sound like something I want to do. So this ends up being a good oath and they all make this oath. However, obviously, they don't realize that a foreign king is going to come and steal Helen. But Helen ends up marrying Menelaus, who is the king of Sparta. So now she is Helen of Sparta as opposed to Helen of Troy, because that happens in a hot second. And the only reason why that happens is because of the divine marriage. So the divine marriage that's happening is between this sea nymph called Thetis and this mortal guy called Peleus. And that is because Thetis basically refused to sleep with any of the male gods, that they all made advances on her because she was hella hot. And she was like, actually, you're all really gross and I want nothing to do with you. And so because of that, then Zeus was like, well, if you don't want to even sleep with me, then you have to marry a mortal. And she was like, I don't really give a shit. Like, that's, as long as I don't have to do anything with you guys, that's fine with me. They end up getting married and they end up having this massive wedding on Olympus, but they don't invite the goddess of discord for obvious reasons, okay? Why in the world would you invite the goddess of discord to a wedding? But they didn't anticipate that Eris, the goddess, was going to find out that she was the only god, the only immortal deity who was not invited to this day, and she is not happy about this. So Eris basically has this golden apple constructed, and on it says, to the fairest. Like, this belongs to the fairest goddess of them all. And Eris basically just has to roll up to the wedding. She doesn't even say anything. She just rolls this ticking time bomb in at this point and then fucks off, and she's like, have fun with that. And so obviously when all the gods see what's written on the apple, we have three goddesses lunge for it because they do believe that they are the fairest of them all. And so we have Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite lunge for it. And they're all squabbling, so they're like, well, we can't figure this out. We'll go to Zeus. We'll ask Zeus, who's the hottest of all of us. They go to Zeus, and Zeus, rightfully so, is like, ha ha ha, I am not getting involved. I know exactly what you guys want from me, and I'm gonna say no. And so they are then forced to go elsewhere to find their answer, which honestly, Zeus does a lot of problematic things. This is one of his highlights, if probably the only highlight of his entire mythology, is when he tells the three of them that he is not making a decision, so go Zeus. The three goddesses then, they go from Olympus down to regular Earth, and they are going in search of someone who can tell them who is the fairest of them all. So they end up finding this random dude in a field, and that random dude happens to be Paris. So they're like, hey, you have no bias towards any of us, so you have to pick who's the fairest of the three goddesses. And Paris is a little overwhelmed because, bear in mind, he is just a random shepherd boy at this point in his life. So he's like, I don't really know if I should be doing that. But all the gods start bribing him. So Hera bribes him, Athena bribes him, and then it gets to Aphrodite. And this is where shit hits the fan, because Aphrodite is like, hey, if you choose me, I'm gonna give you the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, he's like in his late teens at this point, early 20s, possibly late 20s, I'm not even sure. He's a young man, basically. He has not been touched in a while, if ever, okay? And so when Aphrodite says this, without missing a beat, Paris is like, yep, okay, you win. Where is my very hot lady to stand by my side? Which is a problem, because I just told you that the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen. And more importantly, Helen was just given to Menelaus And the Greek heroes had just made a pact that said if anybody tries to steal her, aka Paris, they were gonna go and attack him in order to get Helen back. So that is why the whole Trojan War starts. That's it. In saying all of that, there are differing versions of this myth. However, it's very important to understand that this is the storyline that Homer is writing. So he writes based off the fact that there is a judgment of Paris and that Helen had no say in her marriage. She had no say in whether she went to Troy or not, that she was basically just dragged against her will across the sea from Greece to Troy, which is in Turkey, by the way. So she's dragged there by Aphrodite, and that's important because that is a constant squabble that happens in the book between Paris and Helen. Helen's constantly like, I hate you, and I wouldn't be here if Aphrodite basically isn't keeping me prisoner here in Troy. So that is important. There are later versions of the myth, there are later versions of the story where Helen was super in love with Paris and Paris came to visit Sparta and then she was like, oh my god, I have to get on the boat with you because I hate Menelaus. But that is absolutely not what happens in the Iliad. It is not the legend that is referenced in the Iliad. So that is what this entire series that I'm doing will be based on. It's those stories. So before anybody goes into the comments and starts arguing, you can reference other mythologies in the comments below, but you cannot, nobody else can follow those in regards to reading the Iliad, because the story of the Iliad will not make sense with those backstories of narratives. Okay? So the action of the whole Iliad, though, as I've been saying, takes up a small snippet. It literally is 9.5 years into the battle, and it's about 2 weeks, right? I mean, that's just a ballpark date range, but it's literally about 2 or 3 weeks of the entire battle, just summarized in 24 chapters. So we don't have any of the important parts of the story of Troy that you guys probably know. So like the wooden horse doesn't appear in the story. Achilles' death doesn't happen in the story. The actual siege of Troy doesn't happen in this story. None of that happened. That would have happened in other books that we have reference to, once again, from other writers. So other writers have said, oh, well, we know that, you know, they all popped out of the horse in this book, but that book doesn't survive. Only this one that references that book survives. So we're like, aha, I know it was there because this person said it, type of shebang. But the famous parts that do happen in this book are Patroclus' death, so Achilles' like best friend. He dies in this book. I'm not ruining anything for you, by the way, because this is a like 2,000+ story. If you have chosen not to know what happens in this book, then that's not my problem. So Patroclus dies in this book, and Hector dies in this book. Those are really famous. I'm trying to think of anything else. Oh, Achilles' shield that is depicted, where Hephaestus makes him new armor. That happens in this book, but that's it. The action literally drops us in to an argument that Agamemnon and Achilles are having, which we know, based on the dynamic that the two have, this is probably something that happened in all of the other epics from this cycle, because this argument goes from 0 to 100 very quickly. So you know that they've had this argument like 12 or 14 times probably, or something along those lines, which is why both of them flare up so quickly. And they have a history of hating each other. But we're dropped into that argument, just sort of like, oh, here you go, have fun. So we're dropped into this dynamic, and then the book ends before the actual Trojan War ends. So it literally, it ends with Priam, who's the king, going to get Hector's body back from Achilles. That's the story. It's this very brief moment in the Trojan War. So for our last little part of this episode, I wanted to give you a bunch of resources before we get started. And they are resources that I will be referencing throughout this entire series because I think they are absolutely fantastic into showing you guys the actual Trojan War and simplifying it and making this book very, very easy to understand, which is obviously our whole goal here at Moan Inc. And these sources are not Moan Inc. These are external sources. And the main one that I wanted to highlight to you guys is actually a website called Greek Myth Comics. You guys should 100% be checking this out because Laura, who runs that whole website, she's a classics teacher and she has created some of the most incredible comics for the Iliad. She not only has all of these war lists and all of these death count lists and all of the weapons that are used, she not only has all of that, she also did this wonderful series where they were all chickens, and so described all of the heroes as different chickens, and you get a very good, very basic, but very good idea of what happens in the Iliad according to all of her comics on her website. Like, I 10 out of 10 recommend. I have linked it in the description below. You should also be following Laura on Instagram as well, because she goes into a lot of these wonderful comics and does screenshots of all of those. So you guys need to be checking that out. And I will be referencing her comics throughout my series, because even though, yes, hearing me yap about it is kind of funny and we kind of enjoy it, it's also good to have visual representations of this stuff, because it does start getting a little bit confusing in regards to war, and in regards to the deaths, and in regards to the characters, because, just a spoiler, there are about 400 characters in this entire book, and Greek Myth Comics does a fantastic job of simplifying the basics need to know in regards to all of them as well. So 100% check that out, okay? I will be linking in the description below. I will also be highlighting it over on my Instagram, so check it all out, and connect with Laura, because she's doing an incredible job for the classics community, and I cannot shout her praises enough. Also, don't forget to leave her a little thank you for actually oversimplifying this stuff for you guys, because it is absolutely incredible, and we need to be thanking people who create stuff like this, especially people who create stuff like this for free, just because they want to help you. So don't forget, please don't forget to say thank you to her. But yeah, that is the context for the Iliad that I think is rather important that you guys understand. I know this was a little bit of a longer video today. The videos to come will all just be summaries of each and every chapter in regards to Homer's work. So just so that you guys know, we will just be summarizing the story. That's all we'll be doing. I will not be going into any of the symbolism or any of that stuff. And throughout the episodes, when I feel like you guys might need to know the symbolism of something, I will be linking, again, in the description below, any external resources that are really fantastic, that I think are good introductory things for you guys to be checking out in regards to those books. So next week, I will be posting book 1 of the Iliad, and I can't wait. I'm so excited, because this is just the pettiest story in the entire world. So please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because I will be posting quite frequently and quite quickly. So you guys definitely don't want to miss an episode, and we'll be seeing you next time with more Iliad content here on Monink. We'll see you then.